Yes, Sir Tim Besley is a professor of economics and political science and a W. Arthur Lewis Professor of Development Economics at LSE. He was the president of the Econometric Society in 2018, and he has also served as the president of the International Economic Association. Professor Besley is a past co-editor of the American Economic Review, a journal we've all read, I'm sure, pretty often, and a 2005 winner of the, and I'm sorry if I butcher this name, Yuzhro Janssen Award. And it's awarded by the European Economics Association and is granted every other year to an economist aged under 45 who has made a significant contribution to economics in Europe. And with that, I'll just say that we are extremely honored to have Professor Besley with us, and he can take the floor now. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Yash, for your kind introduction, and thank you for having me. So I'm going to talk about some political economy issues raised by the COVID crisis. And for those of you who are not familiar with the field of political economy, I'm going to try and kind of give you a little bit of an overview of why I think it's important to view the events of recent months through that lens. And why the field of political economy, I think, gives us useful insights into things that are going on and also presents us with certain kind of challenges that I think we have to confront. And then along the way, I will talk about some specific pieces of research to illustrate what I'm going to say. Now, the reason why, so quite early on in the crisis, I was very struck by the fact that one of the questions we could be asking, and we perhaps should be asking, is not what governments are doing, but why they're doing it. And in general, we kind of think that they're doing it for a reason, but not necessarily conforming to what you might call the classic kind of benevolent dictator paradigm of economic policy making. So very often when we think in economic models about policy, we have the notion of a policy maker sort of free from political constraints, who's trying to navigate their way through a policy problem, informed by the best expertise and evidence and so forth. And that's our kind of classical paradigm of optimal policy, from which we derive a lot of propositions about how to regulate or tax or spend money. Now, during the COVID crisis, there were a couple of interesting things that started to happen. One was that suddenly, perhaps more than in our conventional way of thinking, the advice and input of science was suddenly being something that our policymakers were all telling us that they were following. And therefore, it looked like perhaps the triumph of kind of expert opinion over politics, because after all, our politicians were telling us that they were only doing what they were doing because the scientists were justifying that behavior. There's a couple of things about that. One is that relatively rarely did we hear much about economics, at least early in the crisis, that when the first lockdown happened, there was indeed very little discussion, at least by the policymakers, of what the economic consequences would be. And to a significant extent, what happened was more or less the economists looked like they were being reactive rather than proactive. Namely, if you're going to have a lockdown, then sure enough, you've got to think about how you're going to protect jobs and how you're going to protect people who are going to be affected by that lockdown. But it didn't look like the role of economics was very central to that debate and that discussion. So, it could get you thinking about, well, how are we to understand the policy making framework behind COVID, and what was it telling us about our conventional policy making paradigm? Well, I would argue that when we think about the role of politics in economic policy, there's sort of three things where politics really matters. And it turns out they were all pretty important, but people didn't often frame the debate in terms of these three things. But I'm going to argue that if we do reframe the debate about what's been going on and what's likely to continue to go on in terms of those three core roles of politics in economic models, we might get some useful insights into actually how this is all affecting our lives and how ultimately we're going to navigate a way through this crisis. So what are those three supporting ideas that I think are really important to have in our analytical toolkit if we're going to understand how government is responding to the crisis. Well, the first dimension of this I call preference aggregation, which is a little sort of an economist sort of technical way of thinking about the problem. But essentially, at the end of the day, this crisis is having huge distributional effects. For one thing, we've been trying to protect the older and more vulnerable population. So we've been trying to target our interventions very often towards a specific group, and particularly in health policy. So there are particular policies that are targeted towards protecting the vulnerable. But equally, many of the costs of the crisis, particularly post-lockdown, have been borne by people in occupations where working from home is or certainly was not and still is not an option, or whole sectors of the economy. We're about to, of course, on Thursday have a closure of the hospitality industry again, where specific people work. So there's huge impact on particular jobs and occupations, particular impact on younger populations, people whose job prospects or education prospects are being compromised by the crisis. So where does politics come in? Well, pretty much all policies have the characteristic that they're not about Pareto improvements or Pareto worsening of the economy. They are inherently about gainers and losers. Now we can say, well, we have some philosophical model, we're utilitarians, or we've read Amartya Sen, and so we believe in some kind of capabilities-driven approach, whatever is your normative framework for evaluating alternative policies. But inherently, a lot of the things that those models and approaches do is try to give us a framework for thinking about how to trade off gainers and losers. Now, politics doesn't have a social welfare function. Politics is more a practical process for making those trade-offs through institutions that aggregate. So let me give you some examples in the health sphere. Of course, sitting atop of the process in the UK is that we hold periodic elections. Now, rarely does the allocation of health resources come up as a salient political issue. Occasionally, there'll be some discussion about who's funding the NHS more or less generously. And I'm sure other countries have similar debates about whether healthcare finance is an important electoral issue. But by and large, elections have a limited effect on the sort of detailed decisions that are made around the allocation of health resources that have enormous consequences for who gains and who loses. What do we do? Well, in the UK, we have a National Institute for Health and Care Excellence called NICE, which makes those trade-offs on behalf of the government. It decides which kinds of treatments should be legitimized for public treatment and which not. Now, of course, during the COVID crisis, we didn't ask the National Institutes for Healthcare Excellence to make those trade-offs. They very much became part of an independent process operating through scientific advice about how to allocate health resources, how far did we want to cancel operations of a routine kind in order to create more capacity for hospitals. This became very much part of what day-to-day politics was trying to resolve. But very little of it had any direct bearing on electoral politics. None of us were asked to vote on, did we prefer to have more resources allocated to Nightingale hospitals to create more capacity for COVID versus spending the money on perhaps having a better road network even, or a better system of social security. None of these trade-offs were made directly via politics. They were made very indirectly. They were made by politicians who were being put there to do that preference aggregation, to deal with that preference aggregation problem. They were put there to trade off gainers and losers on our behalf. We elected them to put them there to make those decisions. So that a key role of politics, and it became very clear, although not always described in that way, as the crisis progressed, was to form some view about the trade-offs that COVID was placing on the economy and on society, and to do their best to reach that. Now, some economists, by the way, have been extremely critical of that. You may have seen some articles that have been written arguing that had the National Institute of Healthcare Excellence's method of trade-offs be used, the value of the lives saved by closing down the economy during the period between March and July, at least, imposed economic costs far in excess of what would be the value of the lives saved. Of course, not everyone subscribes to the idea that we can turn lives into monetary values and then form an economic trade-off between the two. But somewhere somebody has to make those choices, and ultimately it comes down to whether politics finds those trade-offs persuasive or not. It's not down to whether the economists or society or scientists or anyone else decides how to make those trade-offs. So preference aggregation, absolutely central role of politics and central in the crisis. But very standardly so. At some level, anybody who studied political economy or thought about the role of politics in the economy would be entirely comfortable with the idea, at least, that a central role of politics is to make those decisions. And you can ask, does it make it well or badly? We as economists can criticize the way governments chose to make those trade-offs, but ultimately it's sovereign politics that makes them, and we put people in place through elections, in Britain at least, to make those decisions on our behalf. The second role of politics and political economy is accountability, and that's what happens next, namely that when politicians have made decisions, they are subject to scrutiny for the decisions that they make, and they may face criticism. They may face ultimately the wrath of the voters. The voters may decide that the government made a mess of dealing with the crisis and choose to vote them out of office. But actually, it's a bit more subtle than that. Accountability is a key part of politics, but it depends on many things. And this is something I'm going to talk about again in a few minutes. One is the nature of the scrutiny to which politicians are subject. And that's very different if you look around the world. One important difference across countries is the extent to which politicians and policymakers operate in the light of free media. Many countries around the world have highly suppressed systems of media, and that affects or may affect, and I'll try and persuade you it does affect in a couple of slides I'm going to show you, the way in which countries have responded to the crisis. And this is something that I kind of started to do some research on quite early during the lockdown period, when I noticed that the death rates being reported in the countries without free media were systematically a lot lower than the death rates being reported in the countries with free media. Now, that's curious. Did that mean that the death rates in the countries with repressed media were indeed lower, or maybe that the governments were covering that stuff up? So it gets to a wider issue, though, than just that. It gets to the wider issue of the nature of the public debate that goes on around a crisis like this, and the extent to which governments are subject to scrutiny for their decisions. And it also goes to the role of science. So in different countries, to different extents, scientists were given key roles. So in Sweden, as a famous example, in Sweden, the Public Health Agency, which is an entirely unelected agency, was given a pretty major role in navigating Sweden's response to the crisis. Now, some people would say that's undemocratic. After all, these are not elected officials. They're not officials that are going to face the electorate, therefore, at the end of this process. Why are they being given such a prominent role in navigating the world, Sweden, through a kind of once in a generation, at least we hope once in a generation, crisis? Now, of course, again, there's nothing new here. So one idea that most people are entirely comfortable with is that we give unelected power to central banks. So when it comes to setting monetary policy, Central banks often have power to set monetary policy quite independently of government, and they don't face the same accountability. Central bank governors are not typically elected. Judges who make enormously important policy decisions are not typically elected. So accountability structures, when we look at them in the round, in the way modern systems work, they do make choices between what is going to be decided by politicians and what is going to be decided by unelected bodies. And I mentioned earlier the National Institute here, which makes a lot of important healthcare allocation decisions. So there's a big question is, how do you want to do your accountability? Do you want to have more people responsible for managing a crisis who are directly elected, or do you actually want to hand it over to the experts? Should we just have said at the beginning of all of this, let's let the experts decide, let's get the politicians completely out of the picture? And Boris Johnson could have stood up and said, I'm actually not going to navigate us through this crisis at all. I'm simply going to ask the government chief scientist to do it on our behalf. Now, I don't think that would ever have been a feasible option. But what I think I'm trying to get you to think about is, well, what kind of accountability do we want, and to whom should it apply, and how should it apply, and what should we open up to media scrutiny? You know, how much of the advice that scientists are giving the politicians should be handed over to the media to publish, or should that private advice, should that remain as private advice or not? So there are lots of questions about accountability and what is published, what isn't published, and on what basis. So I sat for a while on the Bank of England's Monetary Policy Committee as a policymaker here in the UK, and there was a lot of discussion around central bank transparency. You know, should for example, the meetings of the Bank of England Monetary Policy Committee just be recorded, and should the minutes be a literal verbatim account of what was said by whom? But no, that's not how it works. What happens is there's an agreed set of minutes that tries to summarize what is often quite a complex discussion. And then that discussion is published in the form of the minutes every month of what the committee's views are about the prospects for the economy. So there's a lot of questions, and the devil is very much in the details about how you do accountability, but that's my second theme. So you have preference aggregation, you have accountability. And my third theme is trust and legitimacy. And I think this has really been, I've left it to last, probably because it's had much less attention in the political economy literature than the first two. There's been lots written about preference aggregation, media voter theorems, things around what leads to a particular way of aggregating preferences. There's been a lot written about accountability, the role of the media, the role of elections too, but much less written about trust and legitimacy. So what do I mean by trust and legitimacy? Well, I'm going to actually begin with a COVID example to illustrate this, because it's such a great illustration about what I mean. So a lot of the way the government has been trying to navigate us through this crisis is by trying to get people to work and to do things against their natural self-interest. So if you were young, say a student at a prestigious university like UCL, you probably think that the chances of having a severe reaction to contracting COVID is not particularly high, not particularly risky, and therefore, why was your ability to stay at university, to go out and do student parties and all the wonderful things that students do, why was that being curtailed? Well, the answer is you're curtailing your enjoyment of student life was justified on the basis that there was a greater good. Namely, society as a whole will be better off if people paid attention to the potential downside risks from behaving in conventional student ways that you all are missing at this point, I'm sure. Now, that is not atypical. I mean, it sounds atypical of what governments do, but actually we make an enormous use of voluntary compliance with government. So, when I pay my taxes, I could probably get away if I would chose to with lots of ways of not declaring my income. I could try and figure out sneaky ways of hiding my income or whatever. But I choose not to. I choose not to because I think even though it might be personally costly, it's the right thing to do to pay my taxes to fund the public services from which we all benefit. And in general, there's a lot of voluntary compliance, both with laws that have private costs and with paying taxes and all manner of other things that we'd rather not do, but we do because we think it's for the greater good that we do them. And the role of government is to try and establish trust. Namely, if I pay my taxes, I trust the government to spend my paid taxes on things that are mutually beneficial, funding the health service, the roads, whatever example of collective provision you prefer. And so it really matters for the effective operation of government that we have high levels of trust in government, because that's what creates the space for effective government operation, that it has legitimacy in the eyes of its people, and therefore that governments can get things done, not by threatening us that if we don't behave in accordance with the things that are the socially responsible things to do, we'll be locked up. It persuades us that this is genuinely in the public interest, and therefore we will tend to conform with that. So to COVID again. I mean, a lot of the things that have happened during COVID have been precisely of the kind that have strained the relationship between standard trust-based models and coercive-based models of government. So coming back to Sweden, Sweden made a decision fairly early on to try and put as much trust in the citizens to behave in a socially responsible way with a relatively light set of formal regulations in the form of lockdowns and restrictions on individual behavior. So you have to reach that balance between formal sanction-based governance and what you might call trust-based governance. And a key role of politics as a process is to try and establish the capacity of government to be able to operate not on the basis of threatening sanctions the whole time, but on the basis of getting people to understand what the public interest is and to obey and to conform with the kinds of behaviors that would promote the public interest. Now, of course, it's proven to be somewhat imperfect, meaning that the government, since the start of COVID, has passed quite severe restrictions on what we could do. It didn't stand up and say, I prefer that people didn't go to the pub and mix in groups in the pub. They could have just said that was what they were trusting people to do. Instead, we've had a successive, well, particularly in the last few weeks, set of increasing restrictions down to what's going to happen on Thursday when the hospitality industry is going to be put back into lockdown, because appealing to people's natural curbing of their self-interest has proven to be infeasible. So it's really raised, though, a big question. What can we do in a practical way to rely more on public trust and less on regulation as a means of trying to deal with the issues that we face? And I mean, a very interesting example, which I think has emerged through the crisis, has been the wearing of masks. So we began without any attempt to get people to wear masks, and then we've tried to persuade people to wear masks, and then we've mandated that people have to wear masks. So we've kind of gone through a chain of changing attitudes, both by policymakers and I think to some extent by citizens in response to that. So it really raises an interesting question about public policy. How do we do that? Is it about messaging? What are the ways of effectively doing it? And we understand as economists a lot more about how to regulate the economy through more conventional things like locking down the economy or using taxes or subsidies than we do about how to effectively get people to comply with things that would promote the public good at private cost. Okay, so that's the bigger picture. So I would argue that actually nothing that's much has happened in COVID has been different from the things we were all discussing before. They've all been manifestations of these things, but in interesting ways. So the form that preference aggregation has had to take is, how do we weigh up the potential costs in people's lives with the cost of the economy? That's a particularly tricky and difficult set of distributional judgments that have to be made. In terms of accountability, what do we reveal to the public about government deliberations, and is that valuable or not? And in terms of trust and legitimacy, how much should we rely on regulation versus other things? So I'm going to end with just a couple of very small illustrations by sharing my screen to show you in sort of a few results that come out of some research I've been doing on this. Sorry, my mouse has decided to lose its battery. Okay, right. While I was trying to share my screen, it's back now. Okay, so here's something which I'm going to show you about free media. This is something, as I said, I mentioned to you, that came up quite early in the crisis. That just show you that what we did, this was with actually a graduate student at the LSE called Sasha Dre. What we did was to very early on in the crisis collect daily data on reported fatalities in COVID, due to COVID in different countries. And in fact, we collected daily data for about 137 different countries. And we asked the question, were the countries with relatively free media experiencing the pandemic in a different way from countries with censored media? Because there are various indicators out there of which countries have free media and which countries have censored media. And what we noticed is that free media countries have actually, on the whole, been much harder hit by the pandemic. I'll show you this in a second. They tended to implement a more effective lockdown, so that's slightly paradoxical. So they had more apparent lockdown, but less, but harder hit. But they tended to have more informed citizens. So citizens knew more about the crisis, and I'll tell you in what way, and they tended to lock down more. So I'll show a couple of things just to illustrate this. So what this is doing, actually, and I'll make it in full screen. So here's something which I mean, maybe this is all I'll show you from this particular work. This is a picture of comparing the experience of COVID of free media and censored media countries around the world. So the blue squares are the censored media countries, and on the vertical axis is the death rate per million people. So what you'll see is that the censored media countries appear to have had a much less serious pandemic than the free media countries. And if you look at the free media countries, and what we've done is we've centered each country's experience on the period before they introduced a lockdown and after they introduced a lockdown. And of the 137 countries in our data, every country eventually implement a lockdown. So we have every country before and after, except Sweden, by the way, which never got to full lockdown. So Sweden isn't here. So what you notice is that in general, the death rate was higher among the free media countries at the point at which they instituted a lockdown. So they are up here, whereas the censored media countries introduced lockdown sort of earlier. And I recall sort of sitting in my front room in front of the television, watching one of the very earliest news broadcasts during the COVID pandemic, and thinking to myself, well, at what point is Boris Johnson going to go on TV? It turned out the answer was March 23rd. But at what point was he going to go on TV and declare a lockdown in the UK? And thinking, well, the death rate's got to be high before he does that, because in a free media country, you may be able to try and do it, but the public want convincing this is the right policy. And the answer was, on average, countries that initiated a lockdown did so after a certain amount of death. And notice they also had much more severe experiences with COVID. So that's kind of interesting. So one thing I was interested in when I saw this was, well, maybe this is all a fiction. So maybe, in fact, all of the censored media countries actually would look like the red dots if we only had governments who are not repressing the information about how much death there really is in those countries. Unfortunately, well, not unfortunately, but when you look in the data, it's somewhat implausible, that view, because although there were quite a few investigative reports of whether some of the censored media countries like Iran or China actually had higher death rates than the reported death rates, the order of magnitude would never have explained these differences that I'm showing you here. So even on the most highly, if you really thought they were covering this up to a very significant extent, I don't think it would explain this difference. But one interesting thing is that when a lockdown was implemented in the free media countries, it tended to elicit a larger response among the citizens than in the censored media countries. And that's partly because the citizens, presumably in those countries, were more convinced of the need to comply with a lockdown than in the censored media countries. And then finally, I'll show you this. What we did, we went and collected data from Google Trends on internet searches on COVID. And what you see is in the countries with free media, people were searching much more intensively for COVID stories, suggesting that they were likely to be much more informed at the time the lockdown came. And indeed, that's what this gap suggests, because they lived in free media countries. So while free media both elicited a larger response from lockdown and it seemed to have more informed citizens, it did not seem to protect the citizens of those countries from having a much more severe pandemic. And that's arguably because the lockdowns were happening much later in those countries, even though the citizens, when they were forced to lock down, were doing so more assiduously than in other countries. Okay, so that's one thing I want to show you. Then I want to show you one more thing from some research I've been doing, and that's on the United States, looking at how social distance, so this goes to my other theme about trust and legitimacy. How did citizens in the United States respond to local outbreaks of the infection? And the answer is very differently. So if you look across counties within the United States, what this shows you is those counties which had a big increase in social distancing versus those counties in the US which had a very small increase, even in some cases, a perverse effect. When they were being asked to socially distance, they were actually going out more, not less. Now, there's a lot of interesting stuff. We know from having, I don't know how many of you are planning to stay up and watch the American election tonight, but we know that the issue around social distancing, wearing masks, became very politicized within the US very early in the pandemic. But one thing, I want to show you a couple of things. And we asked the question, well, what was driving the trends in social distancing? And where was social distancing happening particularly intensively? Did it appear to be related to politics? Did it seem to be related to the economic differences across these different counties? So we did a little bit of research on this. And I'm not going to be able to tell you today about all the detail of what we did, but I want to show you a couple of things. First of all, the social distancing kind of went up rather dramatically. So in the early period of the pandemic, people were increased their social distancing behavior quite dramatically. But then there was a kind of what you might call social distancing fatigue. People started not to socially distance, and then it sort of flattens out in August and September. If you look at how that's related to the actual evolution of the pandemic, so that's the curve I just showed you, you can see that when the cases of COVID really went up, there was no response in social distancing. It didn't look as if people were spontaneously increasing their social distancing behavior. It goes up a little bit here when the infection rates go up rather dramatically. So we were kind of intrigued, what's going on here? Well, if you look at the pattern over time, you get that there was an initial very strong response to social distancing, to the death rate from COVID, followed by a really dramatic decline in social distancing behavior. So what's going on? Well, I'm going to leave you with a couple of thoughts on this, and then we'll open up to Q&A. Look at the decline in social distancing behavior. It absolutely follows the trend in trust in the federal government. So the federal government's trust was declining precipitously exactly at the time when people's social distancing, suggesting that perhaps one thing that's going is that people are losing their faith in government, and so trust is an important driver of this. It's even more striking when you look at the trend in the approval of Trump's handling of the COVID crisis from polling data. So when social distancing goes up, that exactly coincides when people think that Trump is doing a great job. But when they come to decide he isn't doing such a great job, people stop conforming to social distancing, suggesting there's something about this trust and legitimacy process that's really driving it. And one final thing, this says which counties were doing most social distancing in response to the crisis. And notice that in counties where the Democrats have a much higher level of voting, there was more social distancing. So you actually seem to find that the political complexion of a county is something that's correlated with, it doesn't suggest a causal relationship with the way people were doing social distancing. Other more conventional things you might have expected, like in high population density areas, people were tending to socially distance more. And one final thing is where people have more people without health insurance, you tend to get more social distancing. So why am I showing you this? I'm showing you this to show that when you sort of look at the crisis through like a political economy lens, if you want to think of it that way, it makes you want to look at the kinds of political factors that are driving the way either government is behaving or citizens are behaving. And it gives you a kind of rich array of things you can study. I've focused on two things, the role of the media, and then a bit of stuff on what drives social distancing behavior, suggesting that politics can be rather important. With that, I'll stop there and we can have a discussion.